Hey guys, tonight we begin with the sound of boots on wet cobblestone. Not the gallant kind, not marching or purposeful. Just the slow, tired echo of someone moving carefully through a narrow lane where the moon is afraid to shine, the chimney. Smoke hangs low, curling around rooftops like it's trying to hide, and somewhere behind a shutter, a baby stirs, not because of noise, but because something in the night feels off. Not wrong. Just watched. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? Because tonight, we're not peering through grand palace windows or recounting noble speeches carved in marble. Tonight, we slip sideways through history, the kind too strange to be taught and too quiet to be remembered. Not heroic punishments, not even loud ones. Just the small, cold ones. The ones that hung in the air long after they were done. There's a wooden stool next to a frozen pond. A mask with a rusted bit where the tongue should go. A boy who knows what it means when the church bell rings at night, and it's not. For prayer, the punishments in Tudor Britain weren't always about blood. They were about making silence louder, about making shame last longer than bruises, and sometimes about finding the softest way to break someone. But tonight, there's no need to flinch, no need to brace. This is not a story of agony, but of observation, of how a world built strange rituals around justice, and how ordinary people endured them, sometimes trembling, sometimes laughing, sometimes just surviving the cold. Tuck yourself in. Breathe slower now. We'll walk gently into this world together through fog, across cracked stone, and beneath skies that never quite cleared, because even the oddest punishments were still part of someone's bedtime. And that brings us to our first chapter, A Sound in the Night, and the truth no one dared say out loud. It always began with a sound no one admitted hearing, just past the hour when fires were left to smolder, and the streets forgot their names. A cry would slip beneath doorframes and settle into the straw. It wasn't a scream. That would have been easier. It was something in between a whimper and a hymn, soft, wet, and broken at the edges, like someone trying not to be heard but needing to be known. They said it was the Nightman, but no one knew who they were. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He only came when the wind curled oddly through the alleyways, when the gutters clattered though the sky was calm. That was when you knew to bolt the shutters, feed the fire, and lie flat in bed, not asleep, but pretending very hard. No one ever saw him. Not really, but a boy once said he saw a figure moving beneath the eaves of the tanner's shop, thin, hunched, gliding like smoke with boots to clean for the street. He watched from the attic slats, a mouthful of straw keeping him quiet. The figure bent low over a wooden bucket. He left something inside and walked on. By morning, the bucket was gone, and so was the sound. This was a punishment, the elders said, though their voices were dry and sideways when they said it. Not a crime had been punished, necessarily, just a disturbance, a misstep in the order of things. And the Nightman was how the town remembered it had rules. They didn't need stocks every time. Sometimes shame came in softer forms. The baker's daughter once had been laughing too loud. Not wickedly, just boldly, one morning, near the chapel. By dusk, she was quiet. Her shoes were missing, and she walked differently for days. She said nothing. Everyone understood. It was never about pain. It was about the pause it left behind. Some punishments were written in wood and metal. Others were carried like ghosts. Invisible, but sharp, a hunger for warmth that never left, a fear of sleep that settled like frost on the ribs. And if someone ever asked, "Did you hear the cry last night?" The answer was always, no, softer, what cry? Even softer. There was no cry. The town functioned like an old pocket watch ticked by silence, wound by routine. The milk was set out. The carts trundled through the market. No one spoke of the crying. No one mentioned the man with boots to clean, but sometimes when the sun hit the cobbles just right, you could see a line in the dirt. A line that curved. Oddly, as if someone had been dragged slowly, gently, as if they didn't resist or couldn't. Punishment in Tudor Britain didn't always wait for guilt. Sometimes it arrived early just in case, and yet life went on. Bread rose in clay. Ovens. Children played beneath signboards. Evenings still smelled like soot and soap. People laughed, but never too loud, never too bright. There was safety in the dullness of things, the slow churn of chores, the clatter of pails until the sound came again. That distant weeping, the apprentice who heard it first had only been in town a month. He came from a farm, the kind with open skies and space between houses. He wasn't used to walls that touched. The sounds carried differently here. They slipped down chimneys. They pooled in corners. One night, while stirring ashes, he heard it. That soft, trailing sob. He looked up, but the hearth gave no comfort. The room flickered, but nothing moved. No shadows shifted. The windows didn't rattle. But something in his ribs tightened, like a thread being pulled, he told the cooper's wife. She hushed him gently and handed him a new blanket, best to keep warm, she said. When the nights go long, the next morning, he found his shoes filled with ash. No footprints, no soot trail, just ash. Clean, deliberate, cold, and that was enough. He never mentioned the sound again. And somehow, he began to walk quieter. The Nightman didn't need ropes or chains. He didn't shout. He didn't brand. His punishment was not what he did, but what people did after he passed. They moved with care. They watched their tones. They learned the art of unremembering. In a place where crime was vague and guilt was communal, punishment became a kind of ritual, a nudge toward conformity. A lesson that floated in the mist. Even the magistrate's eyes shifted when the cry was heard. Not fear, not guilt, just understanding, because even those with power knew that some things didn't answer to laws. And so, on those nights when the cry returned quiet, distant, not demanding, but present, the town did what it had always done. It listened. It stayed still. It waited for morning, and when the sun rose, it rose just like before. Bright gold, and a little ashamed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this, because in Tudor Britain, punishment wasn't always a spectacle. Sometimes it was a whisper, and sometimes the scariest part was that no one dared call it wrong. And that brings us to our next chapter, where silence had a face, and a tongue was something to be caged. There was a silence you chose. And there was a silence placed upon you. In some corners of Tudor Britain, when a woman spoke too much or simply too well, the answer came in iron. Not a whip, not a cell, but a mask, locked, heavy, shaped like a twisted joke. No one laughed. They called it the brank. Others called it the scold's bridle. But those who wore it didn't call it anything at all. It looked like something out of a cruel harvest, rusted metal shaped like a muzzle, laced with straps and pressed tightly to the skin. But the worst part wasn't what wrapped around the face. It was what slipped inside, a cold, flat plate of iron that sat on the tongue. So the voice could not rise. Not in words, not in pleading, not even in sobs. The village said it was justice, said it stopped gossip, Said it preserved peace, but peace like that sat heavy in the air, like soot on clean clothes, or water in the wrong kind of shoes. It wasn't peace. It was fear that learned to hold its breath. The first time the girl in the baker's lane wore it, she hadn't meant to shout. She'd only laughed too boldly in the market. Mocked a magistrate's gate, soft as a whisper. Everyone heard it. No one joined in .so. The brank came out of the cupboard like a holy relic. The blacksmith's boy carried it. The sexton locked it. The priest looked away. It went on slowly. Never fast. That was part of the punishment. To feel each buckle, to sense the weight descend. And then the tongue so strong, so quick, so full of words was pressed flat, she could walk. She could see, but she couldn't speak. And that was the point. Punishment in this form was not a spectacle of pain. It was a performance of shame. She was paraded through the square, her iron face gleaming like mockery. Children stared. Men looked down. Women turned away, not from cruelty but from memory, because they'd heard that laughter once. In themselves, .no1 asked how long she wore it. That wasn't the kind of time they measured. It wasn't ours. It was seasons of humiliation. The frost of a quiet winter. The burn of spring when everyone still remembered. She tried to return to normal life, hands in dough, voice kept low. But people didn't forget the shape of her silence. It stayed around her like an echo that only others could hear, and the brank. It returned to the cupboard, wiped clean, locked up, ready because it wasn't built for her. It was built for anyone who might sound like her. The blacksmith repaired it between punishments, sharpening the tongue plate, oiling the hinges. Not with malice, just with duty, as if maintaining a piece of farm equipment. Useful, uncomfortable, necessary, and no one saw anything strange in that. Because in their world, silence wasn't just golden. It was enforced. The sound it made when carried was unmistakable. A low jangle. Not quite a bell. Not quite a chain. Like shame on a leash. Some said it wasn't always used. That it only came out in moments of need. But who decided what need meant? A merchant embarrassed in a debate? A husband tired of correction? A church elder losing an argument? The brank didn't distinguish gossip from truth. It silenced both. And over time, the difference didn't matter anymore. Evenings passed quieter. Disagreements were swallowed. And the market became a softer place, not from peace, but from repression. The people adapted. They learned to communicate in glances, in shrugs, in half-laughed nothings. The women, those who had once raised questions with the same ease they raised bread, now chose their words, the way soldiers chose steps on a battlefield. Carefully, one at a time, always ready to retreat, and the brank waited. Sometimes they claimed it was mercy. Better than lashes. Better than dungeons. But mercy is a strange thing when worn as metal on your face. One widow, long after her punishment, was said to still sleep with her hand curled over her mouth, as if the iron never truly left. As if, in dreams, she still felt the bite of silence between her teeth, and perhaps she did, because silence, when forced, doesn't end when the straps are unbuckled. It lingers. It teaches. It reshapes the voice until even free words feel dangerous, and, over time, what began as punishment became habit. No1 had to wear the brank anymore, because everyone had already learned what not to say. So the mask rusted. The cupboard creaked less, and people said things were better now. Quieter, but quiet can mean many things. And in Tudor Britain, it often meant someone had been broken just enough. And that brings us to our next chapter, where boots weren't made for walking. but for waiting, aching, and reminding you of every step you took to boldly, they looked. Like boots, if you squinted. Like something a knight might wear. But these were no armor. They were prisons, 2 at a time, forged in iron and buckled at the calf. The shoes of shame didn't care about battles or mud. They weren't made to protect. They were made to burden. They were punishment. Not in the heat of pain, but in the weight of it. Punishment that stayed. That clung. Punishment that tapped with every reluctant step, not because it had to, but because someone decided it should. He wasn't anyone special. Just a man who had spoken out of turn in a guild meeting. A quarrel over grain storage or tax. Something. Ordinary. But the wrong person was listening. So the boots were brought down from the wall. Rust was wiped away with oil. Leather straps checked, polished, pulled tight. They locked them to his feet while he sat, and they didn't tell him how long they'd stay. That was part of it. Not knowing, the first hour was strange. The second heavy. By the third, he wasn't thinking anymore. Just surviving. The boots were too long to bend the ankle. Too stiff to sit comfortably. Too hot in the day. Too cold at night. Each step pulled at the skin, blistered the heel, knocked the balance just enough that nothing felt natural anymore, and still he walked. Because he had to. To fetch water. To tend the fire. To go to chapel and bow slow, careful, clumsy. Children laughed. Old men muttered. But mostly, people stared. Because they remembered. And they were grateful it wasn't them. He tried to carry on like normal. But normal doesn't sound like iron. Normal doesn't echo down alleyways with every step. Doesn't wake the dog. Doesn't shake the rafters when climbing stairs. At night, he took them off in dreams only to wake and find the weight still. There, not the boots, the knowing, the eyes, the rhythm of metal on stone that never really stopped. A tea wasn't a punishment for what he'd done. It was a warning for what he might do again, and in that way it worked. He said less. He moved. Less. He became smaller, not in body, but in presence, because that's what shame does. It shrinks the soul to fit the cage. The boots came off after 2 weeks. No ceremony. No apology. Just a nod from the magistrate, and an old man with a key. His legs had bruised in bands. His feet were blistered at the seams. But the real pain was quieter. It came later in crowds, in quiet, in the echo of shoes that sounded too much like his had. He kept the boots. Hung them in the rafters above his bed. Not out of pride. Not as a relic, but as a memory of what happens when you're. Words weigh less than iron, and he was not alone. The village had known these boots before. They were passed around. A shared inheritance of disobedience. Not criminality, just missteps. A widow who wouldn't leave a disputed cottage. A miller's son who danced too provocatively at a wedding feast. A maid who sang songs about. The priest's nose, each had worn them. Each had learned to walk smaller afterward. The boots were never quite the same shape for any of them. But the weight that stayed, because it wasn't just the iron that pressed them down. It was the way people looked at them while they wore it, as if their misbehavior had become physical. Visible, and once you could see punishment. You never stopped seeing it, even when the boots were gone. Even when the bruises faded. Even when the laughter returned quieter, gentler, careful around. The edges, there was a man once who wore them and then left. Disappeared down the west road. Never came back. But the boots stayed. They always stayed. In Tudor Britain. Forgiveness had limits. But memory? That lasted longer than iron, and that brings us to our next chapter, not about walking, but about waiting. Exposed. frozen, where a wooden frame and morning frost were sometimes the truest judges of all. There were punishments that hurt, and then there were those that simply lasted. The ones that began long before they were over. The wooden stocks sat at the edge of the market square, not hidden, not central, but just far enough away to be noticed and then ignored. A frame of splintered oak, 3 holes well worn by wrists. And next it didn't need to move. Because the people did, they walked past it every day with baskets, with babies, with boots still muddy from the fields. Sometimes they looked. Most times they didn't, but they always felt it. The presence of punishment without sound, without blood. Just a body held still, and time deciding what came next. He had arrived before dawn. That was tradition. The punishment wasn't about time served. It was about how the time felt. So they dragged him out while stars still clung to the black sky. The cobblestones were damp with frost. The air was tight with the threat of snow, and the only warmth was from his own breath curling out and back again. Barely enough to see, they placed him in the stocks gently, almost kindly. Not because they pitied him, but because rough handling might have made him feel like a criminal. This wasn't about pain. It was about dignity, and how quickly it vanished. His knees buckled once the frame locked. Not from weakness, but from the sudden weight of stillness. There's a different kind of ache that comes from being held in place. From knowing everyone else is moving, from cart wheels squeaking, to merchants setting up stalls, to dogs sniffing, to coins clinking in pockets you can't reach. He blinked frost from his lashes, swallowed spit that had started to sting, and stared at nothing. Because looking at people made it worse. They would meet your eyes for a heartbeat, just long enough to say, "I see you," then turn away, as if shame might be contagious. There were children who giggled, a few, before being shushed, not out of decency, but out of superstition. The stocks weren't a joke. They were a mirror, and no one liked what they saw in them. An old woman left a crust of bread nearby, not in pity, just habit. As if feeding silence had once been part of the custom. A dog barked. A horse sneezed. The church bell rang. And still he didn't move. Couldn't. The cold crept in the way it always did. First the fingers, then the wrists, then the places deeper inside that heat couldn't reach even if it tried. By mid-morning, his back ached from standing. By noon, his neck throbbed from drooping. But he didn't cry. That wasn't the kind of pain it was. It wasn't sharp. It was endless, the kind of pain you don't notice until it disappears. And by then, something in you is different. People offered him nothing, but he didn't expect anything. The punishment wasn't about cruelty. It was about reminding everyone what happens when the rules are questioned. Even softly, they said he had spoken too freely in chapel. Asked if the sermon meant what it said. Not angrily, just curiously, but that was enough. Not to harm him, just to humble him. So he stood, and stood, and stood, until even the wood beneath his chin felt like part of his skin. The shadows moved. The sun traced the sky like a slow accusation. And when the magistrate finally returned, there was no speech. Just a nod, a key, a creak. He stepped out. Stiff, quiet, a little smaller. People looked again, not in judgment, but in caution, because the stocks were always waiting, polished by weather, tested by time, and no one believed they would ever go unused for long. He didn't return to chapel, at least not quickly, not because he was bitter, but because he had learned the value of silence, not the peaceful kind, the useful kind. And others watched, not him, but the stocks, always the stocks. They became part of the town, like a well, or a wall, or a graveyard, permanent, necessary, uncomfortable, but in the hush of winter mornings when fog draped over the rooftops and fires hadn't yet been stirred, you could walk past them and still feel it, that slight chill of memory in the bones, of stillness that wasn't sleep, of silence that wasn't peace. And that brings us to our next chapter, where justice took a deeper plunge, not into morality, but into water. And the only escape was to stop breathing altogether. It was never about the water. It was about what the water did not cleanse. The ducking stool sat folded near the edge of the river, like an old piece of forgotten furniture. Its wood was swollen from seasons of soaking, its ropes stiff, its iron hinges pitted with rust that whispered of past humiliations. It wasn't used often, but it was never gone when someone said a woman had lied or cursed or bewitched the milk to sour this chair became justice, and justice in this place meant immersion, not of the soul, of the body, of the name. They said it wasn't torture. They said it wasn't punishment. It was proof, or cleansing, or ritual, but it was cold. Always cold. She didn't remember the accusation, only that it had started as a whisper, a neighbor who didn't like her tone, a child who cried too long, a husband who needed a reason. The cart came for her before dawn, not violently, just certainly, the way cold fog rolls and no sound. But everywhere the men didn't speak as they tied her in. One held her shoulder too long, as if hoping she'd run. But she didn't. There was nowhere to go. They rolled the long arm of the stool out over the water. It creaked, laughed a little, like old wood does when asked to remember. She was dipped once, then again, each time. The silence on shore grew thicker, because ducking wasn't about the truth. It was about the reaction. Did she struggle? Did she cry? Did she scream into the sky and curse the town that watched her drown in pieces? Or did she go limp, let the water hold her, refuse to play the part? There was no winning. If she fought, she was dangerous. If she yielded, she was guilty. So she simply breathed when she could and waited for someone to decide she'd had enough. They pulled her out by the waist. Her skirts clung like seaweed. Her hair hung like wet rope. Her voice, well, it didn't matter anymore, because once the river touched you, you weren't quite the same. She walked differently after that. Not because she limped, but because the town saw her feet as permanently wet. People gave her space in the market, not out of kindness, out of superstition, and that might have hurt more. To be shunned without sound, to be feared without fire. The ducking stool was returned to its place, folded, silent, waiting. Some said it hadn't been used in years, but the truth, it was just used softly, quietly, as a threat, because its presence alone was enough. Even the river seemed to know. It flowed a little slower near that bank, as if it remembered the women who had met it unwillingly, not witches, not criminals, just women whose words had curled upward too sharply, whose hands had moved too freely, whose presence had made someone feel uncertain. The town liked certainty, and water was an excellent way to blur a person until they were easier to forget. But not everyone forgot. A girl, years later, once dipped her toes in that same river. She said it felt thick, like it doesn't want me here. No one told her why. They just dried her feet quickly and said it was time to go home, because even when the ducking stool wasn't visible, it lived in the muscles, in the whispers, in the silence that rose when women spoke with too much certainty. A tea wasn't always strapped to a beam. Sometimes it was just a look, a rumor, a pause before replying. Sometimes it was just knowing that getting too loud could make you wet, and getting too wet could make you disappear. So the river kept moving. And so did the stories, but under the mud, under the reeds, under the smooth river stones, there was a current of voices that never came back up. They didn't need vengeance. They didn't need flame. They just wanted someone to remember that punishment didn't always come with screams. Sometimes it came with bubbles, and that brings us to our next chapter, where punishment came not with water or wood, but with hunger. A slow, deliberate hunger that felt almost polite. There's a kind of punishment that doesn't bruise, that doesn't chain you, or dunk you, or force you to wear the shame across your face. It simply gives you less, and then waits, bread, water, and time. That was the sentence. It sounded mild, even generous. After all, they said, you wouldn't starve. Not really, but what they didn't say was this: survival is not the same as living. He was placed in the cell on a Thursday. A man who had taken too much wood from the edge of a nobleman's land. Not stolen. Collected. To keep warm. No trial. Just a nod. Just the kind of crime that made people shrug and say, well, he should have known better. They brought him bread. Hard. Pale. Dense enough to press dents in the palm, and water clear, but always slightly cold, as if it had been left near the wall too long. That was it. No salt. No warmth. No kindness wrapped in steam. The cell wasn't cruel. It was simply indifferent. A square space with one blanket and a stone bench that slopped the wrong way. He passed the first day pacing. The second curled in the corner. The third pretending he couldn't smell food from the guardhouse beyond the wall. No one beat him. No one screamed. They didn't have to. The punishment was already working. Hunger is a patient thing. It sharpens, then dulls. At first, it makes you alert, wide-eyed and twitching at crumbs. Then it softens the edges, makes you forget what you were angry about, why you were even here. The bread didn't change. It stayed the same. 3 pieces a day. Cracked. With the sound of dried twigs, chewed slowly to fill the silence. He tried to make games from the crumbs. Tried to stretch the water across hours like a holy ritual. But even prayers sounded too loud in that place. Time, like appetite, became vague. Measured not in hours, but in how hollow he felt between swallows. Others had passed through the same cell. Their names were gone, but the marks remained, scratches on the wood, lines carved into the stone, one faded smear of something that once might have been soup. This was not a place for stories. This was a place for forgetting, and that's what happened. He forgot what the fire had felt like when he burned the stolen wood. He forgot the shape of his sister's face. He even forgot the taste of butter, that soft, golden dream of better. Days. By the end of the week, he didn't walk out. He was let out, slowly, quietly. And still hungry, the bread had kept him alive. But the punishment had worked. He no longer expected more, and that was the goal all along. To teach satisfaction with less. To make the absence feel natural. To give deprivation a rhythm so gentle. It felt like mercy. He never took wood again. Not from the nobleman's land. Not from anywhere that wasn't clearly his. He became careful. Lean. Soft-spoken. And that made him, in their eyes, a better man. But there was something in his eyes that never returned. A certain brightness. A certain hunger, not for food, but for fairness, and it had been starved out of him. That cell stayed ready. It didn't need repairs. Just rest. Just time. Just the occasional loaf, because in Tudor Britain, you didn't need to bleed to be punished. You just needed to feel the absence of comfort long enough to think twice next time, And that brings us to our next chapter where fire was not warmth, but permanence. A searing brand on skin, and the quiet humiliation of being labeled by your past. They said it would be quick. Just a flash, a hiss, a mark, but the boy didn't care about speed. He cared about the fire, how it looked, how it breathed. The brazier stood at the far end of the courtyard. Its coals had been stirred since before dawn. Smoke rose in lazy ribbons, curling like question marks in the pale light of morning. He stood third in line. 2 ahead, 5 behind. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They all knew what was coming. A letter, pressed to skin. Forever. He didn't remember what he'd stolen. Some cloth, maybe. A chicken. It hardly mattered now. The sentence had been passed. Not prison. Not a beating. Just a mark, branded. As a warning. To others. To himself, the irons sat in a tray like sleeping snakes. Each one shaped with care letters of the law, twisted into steel. T for thief, V for vagrant, F for felon. They didn't brand the noble or the clever, only the poor, the hungry, the ones no one would protect. The boy stared at the iron as it was pulled from the coals. It glowed, not orange, but white, so bright it made his eyes water. The first man went forward, stoic, until the touch. Then a sound, not a scream, but a gasp that curled into a whimper. The smell came next. Flesh and iron. Like roasted leather. Like something you weren't supposed to recognize. The brander didn't pause. Didn't flinch. He'd done this too many times. They pressed a cloth to the wound. Not to heal it. To shape it. To make the letter crisp, because the letter had to show. Clearly, permanently. The second went faster. A girl, barely more than a whisper in a dress. She shook, but didn't cry. And when she walked away, her back was straighter than before. The boy was next. He stepped forward. Not brave, just resigned. The iron was ready. The guard nodded, and then it touched. He didn't scream. But the world did in his ears, in his lungs, in the sudden silence of everything that wasn't pain. The letter was T. Of course. Thief. The heat traveled through him. Like guilt, like memory, like judgment. And then it was done. He staggered. The cloth came. Pressed. Held. The pain pulsed like a second heartbeat. But it wasn't just the wound. It was what came next, because now everyone would know. No matter what he wore. No matter where he went. The letter would speak. Louder than he ever could dot. IT wasn't just a punishment. It was a name. Given, not chosen. And names in places like this lasted longer than blood. He left the courtyard quietly. Not limping, but smaller. Dimmer. No1 offered him comfort. But no one needed to. The fire had already done its job. He didn't steal again. Not because he repented, but because he couldn't afford to be caught again. Another letter meant death, or exile, or worse, a life of being seen but never truly looked at. Some branded tried to hide their marks. Scarves, mud, lies, but the skin remembers. And the people always knew. It was in the way you moved, the way you avoided the sun, the way your voice dropped when asked where you came from. And the brands, they waited in trays warmed by fire, cleaned by flame, not sacred, just efficient. A letter here. A life changed there. Justice in Tudor Britain didn't always want you gone. Sometimes it wanted you marked, so others would learn, and fear, and behave. The boy grew older, wiser, quieter, but the mark stayed. Through winters, through summers, through prayers, through silence, and in time, he didn't need the letter anymore. He had become it, and that brings us to our next chapter where pain came not in private, but in public. Under church towers. Besides sermons, and always timed to the ringing of Sunday bells. IT was the kind of Sunday that made people dress a little better. Lace at the collar, wool brushed free of straw, shoes cleaned if not shined. They came not just for worship, but to be seen worshiping. Because in a small Tudor town, faith wasn't just private. It was part of your reputation, your rhythm. But some Sundays began with something older than the sermon, something louder than the choir, something that reminded everyone why righteousness was safer than justice. IT began with the post, set just outside the church gate, weathered, simple, unmistakable. IT wasn't tall, just tall enough. A thick beam, scarred with rope marks and old blood. They didn't clean it much. Only when the weather did it for them. The man brought forward that morning didn't resist. He knew the path. He knew the ritual, hands tied, shirt off, eyes forward. He didn't beg. He didn't need to. The punishment had already been decided. The lash was not a question. It was an answer. The priest was already inside, prepping scripture, polishing words about mercy, about forgiveness, but mercy came later. This was tradition. The lashes fell with the rhythm of a bell, not rushed, not slow, measured. Like each stroke was a sentence, and the people watched, not all. Some turned their heads. Some prayed. Some wept quietly, the way a child weeps when they don't understand, but feel something terrible is happening nearby. But others counted, not cruelly, just out of habit, to pass the time. 5, 6, 7, each one leaving red lines like signatures across his back, marks of the law, of order, of expectation. They said he'd been caught cheating weights at the market, adding stones to the scale, stealing slivers of silver from housewives with baskets. Was it true? Maybe. Maybe not. It didn't matter now. The whip had no curiosity, only purpose. After the final lash, they left him there, tied, bare, humiliated, because the punishment wasn't just pain. It was being seen in pain by your neighbors, your friends, your enemies, and by God, whose house sat just a few steps away. Children were told not to stare, but they always did, because seeing a man hurt and realizing he couldn't stop it was its own kind of education. Eventually, someone would come with a cloth, not to bandage, just to wipe, to make the post ready again. He was untied as the first hymn began, the choir's voices rising just as his knees buckled. A strange kind of harmony. He didn't enter the church. He limped away, into the trees or behind the butcher's stall, someplace quiet, someplace where backs weren't judged, and still. The post stood, waiting. A few weeks later, it welcomed another, a woman, caught with a borrowed coin and a lie. They said she needed correction. They said the post did God's work. She was tied tighter, lashed less, but shamed more, because the post didn't care who you were, only that you had been chosen. The townsfolk had grown used to it, not numb, just practiced. They knew when to look away and when to look directly. Sometimes they brought their own children closer. Watch, they whispered. This is what happens when you forget who you are. And the children watched and remembered the post became a part of Sunday. Like prayer, like bread, like the uncomfortable pews that creaked under shifting repentance, and every time the whip cracked, so did something else, not the law, not the peace, but the belief that church was only about salvation, because outside those doors, before any, sermons were read, justice had already spoken, and it spoke in welts, in quiet sobs, in backs turned toward the sky, but no one complained. No one questioned, because the post had always been there, and the church had always allowed it, and that brings us to our next chapter, not of lashings or brands, but of stillness, of standing so long in shame. Time itself became part of the punishment. There were no bells this time, no lash, no rope, just wood. And waiting, the pillory stood at the center of the square, a quiet monument to time stretched thin. 2 planks, 1 hinge, 3 holes for the neck, the wrists, and whatever pride you brought with you. It didn't hurt at first. That was the deception. You could stand upright, breathe freely, look around, but that freedom lasted minutes. And the punishment lasted hours. He had been caught forging signatures. A minor thing, really. He hadn't even profited much. But the law wasn't angry. It was disappointed. And disappointment, in Tudor Britain, came with public stillness. He stepped up at noon. The sun already high, already hot. They clamped the frame shut. No one cheered. No one cursed. They just watched. The same way you watch rain beginning curiously, without expectation, knowing it might last longer than you think. At first, he held his head high, nodded at a few familiar faces, even smiled, tried to look noble, but nobility doesn't last. When your knees begin to tremble, when your shoulders scream from being held in place, when your spine hums with a pain that has no name. By the second hour, he wasn't noble anymore. He was sweating, blinking dust from his eyes, and learning the true shape of shame, not the loud kind, not the crying, begging kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that turns you into something people step around. A dog barked near his feet. He didn't flinch. Couldn't. A boy threw a rind of fruit. It hit the wood with a thud. Not malicious, just tradition, because part of the pillory was the crowd. Not required, but inevitable. They came like FLIs to a wound. Curious. Idle. Maybe a little afraid, because watching punishment makes you feel safe. It means it isn't you. He focused on the cracks in the wood, on the shape of a nail head, on anything that wasn't his arms, his neck, his shame. Time blurred, not into minutes, but into aches. The ache of a neck not meant to hold weight this way. The ache of legs locked without movement. The ache of eyes that couldn't close. And then the worst ache, the ache of being seen, but not spoken to. And no one called his name. No one asked if he was all right. Because he wasn't supposed to be. He was supposed to stand and wait and be looked at. That was the point. By the 4th hour, he wasn't sure if he was trembling from pain or fear or something in between. His thoughts grew stranger. He imagined he was part of the post, that the pillory was slowly swallowing him, not in wood, but in silence and still. People came. A woman with a basket of fish. A priest passing by, eyes forward. A child who stared too long, then waved. That wave soft, unthinking, was the only kindness he remembered. Eventually, a man approached. Not a judge, not a guard, just a clockmaker. He unlocked the pillory, didn't speak, didn't offer a hand, and the man stepped down. If you could call it stepping. It was more like falling in pieces. His shoulders slumped. His knees cracked. His breath came in odd, shallow loops. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just walked away. Later, someone asked what it was like. He said nothing, but he never stood still again, even in church, even at meals. He shifted, always, as if afraid of being rooted, because the pillory wasn't about pain. It was about memory, about standing long enough to forget who you were, and long enough for others to forget. 2. And that brings us to our next chapter, where shame wasn't nailed to wood, but stitched into clothing, and worn like a second skin through every market, prayer and glance. There's something about clothing that comforts. The weight of wool in winter, the hush of linen on skin, the way a well-worn sleeve feels like home. But not all garments were made for warmth. Some were sewn to sting. Not the body, the soul. In Tudor towns, when shame needed to walk, they stitched it. Bright colors, awkward cuts, and words. Words that clung like thorns. They called it the punishment cloak. But it wasn't really a cloak. More a mockery of one, rough cloth, dyed to loud. Yellow, sometimes red. Stiff seams, frayed edges. And across the back, a painted word. Liar, drunk, lecher, thief, sometimes just a symbol, a broken ring, a crooked cross, a bleeding heart. It wasn't armor. It was exposure. A uniform for those who had already been judged. He was given one on a Tuesday. A man who had cheated waits in the guild, they said. No branding, no lashes, just cloth. And time. They didn't lock him away. They made him walk. To church, to market, to the well. The cloak swayed with every step, announcing him, naming him, even when he kept his mouth closed. Children pointed. Old women spat. Friends pretended not to know him, but he kept walking. Because that was the sentence. To be seen. Every day. Until the magistrate said otherwise. It didn't chafe the skin, but it scraped something deeper. He couldn't forget it was there. Even when he slept, he hung it on a peg by the bed, and it seemed to watch him. Softly, patiently. Some mornings, he thought of not wearing it. Just once. Just to feel unseen. But he never did. Because the town noticed. Always there was a woman once who'd refused. She was found scrubbing her front steps, the cloak tucked under a basket. They made her wear two after that. Layered. Heavy. With different words on each. The worst part wasn't the fabric. It was the way it caught light. How it shimmered just enough to make eyes linger. How it turned silence into judgment. Even kindness felt pointed. A smile became a question. A loaf of bread charity. Not warmth. And yet, it worked. He stopped going to the guild. Stopped selling altogether. Found work hauling stones by the river. Where fewer people watched, the cloak followed him. Always, until one day, it was gone. Not burned. Not cut. Just taken. Away by the magistrate. Folded. Stored. Ready, and he felt lighter. But not free, because the town still remembered. Not the color. Not the word. But the shape of him in it. Some saw him and still squinted, as if expecting him to glow again. He walked straighter, spoke softer, and learned to wear humility, like a quieter cloak. Others still wore theirs. Sometimes for weeks. Sometimes for seasons. One man wore his until it frayed at the seams, the painted word reduced to a shadow. The punishment cloak didn't make you hurt. It made you visible. And in Tudor Britain, that was often worse, because pain fades. But memory, sewn into every glance, lasts. And that brings us to our next chapter, where even sleep was a stranger, and the worst punishment was not the lash, But the quiet refusal of dreams.it wasn't dark in the cell. Not completely. There was a window, barely a slit, but it caught the moon just enough to remind him he wasn't meant to sleep. Not yet. Not comfortably. Maybe not at all. He had been placed there for reasons that sounded like law vagrancy. They'd said loitering, lurking, existing in the wrong place with no right name, but what they truly punished him with was not confinement. It was rest with, held, the bed if it could be called that was aboard. Tilted. Just enough to keep the spine curious. The blanket was burlap, smelling faintly of rot and older men who hadn't spoken in months, and the silence. Not real, not ever. The walls made noise. They breathed, moaned, creaked as if remembering other prisoners, other nights, other restless legs. He tried to sleep. Of course, he did. But the cold had fingers, and they crept up the spine, into the collar, between the ribs where breath should have felt safe. And then there were the sounds. Not from ghosts, not from demons, just from the cell next door, a cough, a scratch, a muttered prayer that never quite finished. The guard walked past, his boots echoing with the slow cadence of someone who enjoyed being heard. He paused outside the door once. Twice, the key rattled, but never turned. A kind of game, not to scare, just to remind. Sleep was not a right. It was a gift. And tonight, it would not be given. He shifted, tried the floor. Too hard. The bench again. Too narrow. He thought of counting. But numbers only made the minutes longer. So he stared at the ceiling and let his thoughts dissolve. He remembered his father's voice. The one story he used to tell about a man who never slept and eventually disappeared. He used to laugh at it. Now he wasn't sure it was a story. He wasn't beaten. He wasn't starved. He was just awake, and somehow that was worse, because in wakefulness there was space. Space to regret, to question, to imagine. He imagined his own release, but it never came at the right time. Never with the right words. The door never opened. The guard never nodded. He was always just on the edge of it, about to be freed. But not yet. The mind is cruel when it wants rest and finds none. It creates. It replays. It invents wrongs that never happened. He thought about people he hadn't spoken to in years. Things he should have said. Bread he should have saved. Sleep stayed outside the walls. It knew better than to come in, and when morning finally clawed its way through the slit of light, it didn't bring relief. It brought more noise, more movement, more reminders that he had made it through another night of not sleeping. The guard opened the door, said nothing, but looked. With that look that said, "You're different now, aren't you?" He nodded. He was, because punishment doesn't need bruises. Sometimes it just needs a night without dreams. He walked out slowly, blinking too often, limbs stiff from holding in frustration, and no one marked his release with a paper, or a prayer, or a plan, just the slow fading of memory that began the moment he stepped into the daylight, but sleep still didn't come. Not even then, because once you've learned to fear the night, even pillows feel sharp. And that brings us to our next chapter, where the pain didn't come from a whip, but from wooden shoes nailed shut to make every step a private punishment. They looked almost harmless. 2 simple shoes. Wooden. Blocky. Carved from elm, maybe oak. No laces. No comfort, but once your feet went inside, they weren't shoes anymore. They were cages. Punishment that walked with you everywhere. They called them just as clogs, or shame shoes, or sometimes nothing at all, because the sound they made said enough. Clack, 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 a noise that turned roads into judgments. The punishment was simple. The shoes were nailed shut, not to keep them on, but to keep your feet still. No wiggle room. No space for toes. To shift or heels to breathe. They didn't bleed you. They didn't tear the skin. They just pressed. And pressed. And pressed until the walk became a limp. And the limp became a crawl. And the crawl became a kind of prayer the man who wore them had cheated a debt, or borrowed too boldly, or angered the wrong official. No jail. Just shoes. For a week. At first, he thought he could bear it. He'd walked further for less. Had boots that pinched harder, but that was before the nails, 6 through each sole. Not into his foot. Just through the shoe. Bent inward just enough to scrape. Not stab. Scrape. The pain wasn't sharp. It was persistent. It taught. And it never ever stopped. He still had to move. To eat. To find firewood. But each step was a decision. Each breath carried a wince, and the people watched. Not with cruelty. With habit. Because they'd seen this before, the shoes were passed around. Like a bitter inheritance. Cleaned after each use, if only barely. They weren't fitted. They didn't need to be. Pain doesn't require precision. Children laughed once. Only once. Until their mother hushed them and made them sit. Because even wooden shoes can echo across generations. The man didn't cry. But he stopped speaking. Stopped asking. Stopped expecting. By day 4, he no longer walked. He paced. One step forward. One back. A rhythm of survival. A song without music. He slept sitting. Because lying down made the shoes press differently. More cruelly. Less predictably, he dreamed of grass. Of walking barefoot. Of silence. Of the day these things would be removed. When the magistrate came with the crowbar, he flinched. Not from pain. From hope. The shoes cracked as they were pried loose. Not broken. Just released. His feet were raw. Misshapen. The skin puckered where pressure had lived. He didn't say thank you. There was no custom for that. Only nodding. And limping. And learning not to curse the ground beneath you. He didn't wear shoes for a while after. Let the earth touch him. Soft dirt. Warm straw. The edges of puddles he once stepped around. The wooden shoes were returned. Stacked neatly in a box, waiting. Their punishment wasn't loud. Wasn't final. But it lingered. You could hear it in the footsteps of those who had worn them. A drag. A pause. A memory. And that brings us to our next chapter, not about shoes or walking, or even pain, but about mercy offered in public, and the performance required to earn it. Mercy should feel warm. Like a blanket offered, or a handout stretched in. The cold, but in Tudor Britain, mercy was a performance. And sometimes it felt colder than the punishment itself. They called it, the pardon, a second chance. A lifting of sentence. A kindness, but it never came quietly. Never privately. It arrived only when an audience was gathered, when eyes were ready, and the stage was set with expectation. He was led to the square on a Monday. No chains. Just presence. His crime wasn't severe, a forged paper, a borrowed name, something. That bruised rules, not broke them, but he had begged. Properly. Formally. With ink and humility. A letter written not in anger, but in submission, and the pardon had been granted. But not freely. Not without price. He would need to kneel. Publicly. To confess. Loudly. To weep visibly, if not honestly, because mercy, when given by authority, needed witnesses. and witnesses needed satisfaction. So he knelt, in the dust, before a table, where the magistrates sat in layered cloth and practiced stillness. A small crowd gathered, not because they cared, but because something was happening. People love a spectacle. Even one dressed in softness, he spoke the words they gave him. Regret, gratitude, obedience, the language of the forgiven. His voice shook. Not with guilt, but with the effort of making it believable. He didn't cry. So he sniffed, twice, and rubbed his eyes as if memory had stirred something painful. The magistrate watched, stone-faced. And then, finally, he nodded. The pardon was announced. Not as a gift, but as a lesson. The law is just, but it can be gentle. Let this be an example. People clapped. A few. Most just turned away. The show was over. He stood slowly, dusted off his knees, walked with his head just low enough to imply humility, but not so low as to seem broken. He was free, but not free because every step he took carried the memory of having to prove he deserved it. Mercy should feel clean. But this one clung, like smoke in fabric, like a tear not quite wiped away. Some whispered that he had faked it, that his regret was too smooth, his bow too shallow, because in a public forgiveness, the line between grace and performance is thin. Others envied him, not because he'd been spared, but because he'd survived the humiliation. They weren't sure they could, and the town, in its way, moved on. But he remembered not the words, but the feeling of people watching him kneel, of the silence before his voice cracked, of the way mercy had tasted like iron, like dust, like a smile you're forced to return. He lived quietly after that, not ashamed, just cautious. He gave no more speeches, signed no more names, asked for nothing, because once you've begged, in public, everything else feels like noise. The magistrate never mentioned him again. Why would he? The lesson had been taught. The cloak of forgiveness, once draped, slipped off unseen, but the cold lingered. Because sometimes the softest punishments leave the deepest shadows. And that brings us to our next chapter, where shame didn't walk or kneel, but hung above the world, swinging slowly in the wind. They didn't bury him. Not yet. Not properly, instead. They hung him. Not by rope, but by iron. The cage was narrow, built like a ribcage, bent to the shape of a body, but never meant for comfort. A T swung from the tree at the edge of the road, where travelers passed, where children gathered, where the wind could touch every exposed inch. This was not execution, not immediately. This was display, punishment after punishment, a warning in silhouette, a sentence written in shadow. The man inside had stolen from a noble's caravan. Or maybe he hadn't. No one cared much now. His fate had already lifted off the ground. They placed him in the cage at dusk. Feet first, bent, twisted slightly to fit. He didn't shout. That came later. At first, he was just silent, confused, then still, then very, very aware. The tree groaned with every gust. Not loudly, just enough to remind him that even nature was part of the sentence, and the birds came. Of course they did, drawn by movement, by noise, by opportunity. They pecked first at the corners, his sleeves, his boots, his hair. Later they grew bolder. People passed below. Some muttered prayers. Some laughed. Some didn't look at all, but the cage kept swinging. Always swinging. Food was given. Barely. Water sometimes. When the guards remembered. When the rain didn't come, the real punishment was not the elements. It was time Time spent watched. Time spent heard but not helped. Time spent with nothing to do but think of all the ways your body didn't quite fit the metal wrapped around it. He lasted for days. Maybe 5. Hard to say. That be why the end. His voice was hoarse. His eyes distant. His shape smaller than it had started when they brought him down. It wasn't with reverence. It was with gloves and ropes and a shovel. They buried him in silence. No marker. Just ground. Just memory, but the cage stayed. Empty now. Swinging still. It was never cleaned. Never oiled. Never removed because it didn't need to be used to work. Its presence was enough. Children avoided the tree. Old women crossed themselves when the wind blew west, and the town learned not to steal, not to question, not to forget that the sky, too, could hold punishment. One boy said he saw the cage move even when the wind was still. Another claimed it creaked at night, as if remembering, as if calling, but most just walked faster. Eyes on the road, feet steady, because some punishments don't end when the body's gone. Some keep swinging, and that brings us to our next chapter where feet moved freely, but not proudly. Because the road of shame was long, quiet, and walked by choice, but never by will, there was no rope, no guard, no iron pressed to skin, just feet and eyes, and the knowledge that you were the reason the street had gone quiet. It was called the walk, sometimes the parade, but never with celebration. It wasn't punishment by force. It was punishment by presence. He was told to walk from the church steps to the far end of town. No speaking, no looking back. Just walk. They said it was justice. For speaking against the alderman. For words that unsettled. For ideas that made others shift in their pews. So he stepped forward, barefoot, with nothing to carry but the weight of being watched. At first, it seemed simple. A road he'd walked 100 times. Cobblestones he knew like old friends. Shops with shutters he helped paint, but today they were different. Stiffer, colder, turned slightly away. He didn't walk alone. There was a drummer soft, and behind him townsfolk, not required, but present, some out of curiosity, some out of obligation, some out of quiet spite. Each step echoed, not because the road was loud, but because no one else spoke. The silence was orchestrated, tuned like an instrument. Each rustle of fabric, each cough, each footfall part of the song. The path stretched longer than it ever had. The market was full, but no one called out prices. A dog barked. Someone dropped a cup, but still he walked, not proud, not broken, just moving, because that's what punishment demanded. You had to be seen, to be present, so others could distance themselves. The hardest part wasn't the stairs. It was the footsteps behind him, the ones that followed, that watched, that measured his pace as if walking through his soul. There were children among them, mothers too, people who'd bought his bread, shared his fence, once asked for help lifting sacks of grain. Now they watched him walk, as if they'd never known him at all. The drummer didn't speak, just tapped, softly, a rhythm that felt like judgment, like time passing without mercy. At the end of the path, he stopped. A hand touched his shoulder. A priest's voice offered the final line, "May he be restored to grace," but no one clapped. There was no grace in it, only stillness, and the long, shuffling sound of people turning away. He stood there for a while, alone, until the square, empty. No cell, no stocks, just silence, but he knew he had been caged all the same. Not in wood or iron, but in memory, because no one forgets the one who led the silent parade. He walked home with no one behind him now, but the echo stayed. Of the feet, of the stairs, of the space between them all, and that brings us to our next chapter, where the room was dark, the candle low, and the punishment was wrung from your lips by light and silence both. The room was small. Stone walls, a table, and a candle. That candle was the only light. And somehow, it made everything feel darker. It flickered more than it glowed, moved with every breath. Every lie, they brought him in gently. No shouting, no chains, just a firm hand on the shoulder and the soft click of a door closing behind him. Just talk, they said, as friends. Nothing formal, but the room made liars of everyone. He sat. The stool creaked. The candle guttered, and the questions began, not shouted, not screamed. Whispered. As if suspicion was sacred. As if guilt was something fragile that needed coaxing into the light. Where were you on the night? Who else was there? Do you believe in the old ways? The questions came soft, but they stacked, layered, pressed like books on a shelf, and the man, tired, cold, with hands that had already started to shake, answered truth first, then guesses, then what they seemed to want, because sometimes punishment wasn't pain. It was needing to give them something just to leave. They didn't hit him. They didn't threaten him. They didn't need to. They let the candle speak for them. Every flicker felt like a clock. Every minute a dare. To stay silent, to stay upright, to stay unchanged, but the room was built to change you. A table between you that didn't need to be there. A chair too short. A silence that hummed. He started to confess. Not to crimes. To ideas. To thoughts he hadn't had. To doubts he hadn't voiced because they needed something. And he needed rest. So he gave them words. Soft. Shaped for approval. He said names. Some real. Some not. He saw the smiles. The nods. Very good, they said. You're almost done. But there's no end to that kind of confession, because once you admit to the wrong truth, you become the lie. They let him go. Eventually, he stood, took the candle with his eyes, still flickering, still asking. The cold hit him harder outside. It always did. After those rooms, he walked home differently. Not broken, but rearranged. He didn't look people in the eye, didn't enter the chapel, didn't speak of the night. The candle watched him tell a story he would never believe again. He saw others go in after him. Different faces. Same creak of the stool. Same hush before the door closed. He wondered what they would say, what they would invent, because confession wasn't truth anymore. It was survival. And that brings us to our next chapter where, behind a prison wall, something unexpected grew. Green. Soft. A kindness that didn't erase cruelty, but made it bloom more quietly. The garden was small, tucked behind the farthest cell, with a stone wall cracked just enough to let the morning in. No sign. No fence. Just a patch of earth that hadn't been flattened by boots or forgotten by frost. It wasn't official. No. One had assigned it. No magistrate had written it into order. It began with a jailer. An old one. Quiet. Whose hands had held more keys than crops. But one day, he planted mint. For the smell, he said. To cover what lingered, the first sprigs came slow. Bent from wind. Bruised by the chill, but alive, and then came thyme, then parsley, a line of beans that curved like ribs. He never told the prisoners why. Just let them see Let them watch as something green defied the gray. The inmates called it the patch, not mockingly, not reverently, just softly. Because softness had become rare, they took turns watering it. When allowed, poured spoonfuls of drinking. Water at the base of new shoots. Some even spoke to it. Not because they thought it would answer, but because it didn't. Judge. It grew. Whether they were guilty or not, the garden didn't care who'd stolen, who'd lied, who had whispered the wrong words in the wrong rooms. It cared for sun and time, and the hands that knew to be gentle. The jailer never smiled, but he gave seeds, tucked into crusts of bread, left in corners, and the prisoners planted them, under windows, between stones, in shoes that would never walk again. Something changed. The garden didn't forgive, but it softened. Edges, minds, arguments lessened. Songs returned, low at first, then with rhythm. Like a heartbeat restored, one man carved a wooden sign. Mercy root. It hung crooked. It stayed. No one stole from it, even the hungry, even the angry, because the garden wasn't food. It was hope, disguised as basil. Seasons passed. Frost returned. Some plants died. Others endured. The jailer did too. Until one day, he didn't return. Another took his place. One with cleaner boots and no love for leaves. The garden was stripped. Clutter, he called it. Softness. We can't afford, but by then, the prisoners knew. The roots ran deep. Seeds had been taken, tucked into sleeves, into hollow bread crusts, into memory, and gardens appeared again. Behind other cells, under beds, in corners where light barely reached, because once kindness takes root, it doesn't need permission, just space and patience. They remembered him, the old jailer, not as a savior, not as a saint, just as a man who knew the value of mint. In a place built for despair. And that brings us to our next chapter, where sound, not soil, sprouted life in darkness. And a song sung behind stone lasted longer than any sentence. It started with a hum, low, almost imagined, a sound too soft to call a song, too real to be silenced. In the dark corners of the prison, where day came late and hope came slower, music still found a way in, not from instruments, not from choirs, from throats. Dry, cracked, quiet, but still able. It was a woman first. In the cell where rain slipped through the ceiling and left silver puddles in the straw, she sang a lullaby, one she had sung for her child years before. When lullabies still meant sleep, now it was for herself. To soften the stone, to fill the space between footstep and dread. Others heard, didn't speak, but remembered the tune, and later, when the nights turned colder, they sang it too, not all at once, not in harmony, just pieces, drifting through cracks, climbing walls, settling like dust on everything. Then came the chance, wordless at first, a rhythm made of breath and pacing, of footsteps repeating the same loop until the mind made music from it. One man tapped on the bars, not to escape, to count 4 beats, then silence, then 4 again, a kind of defiance, a reminder, I am still. Here, I still make sound. Guards didn't stop them. Usually, some even listened, pretending not to, leaning a little closer when voices rose at dusk, because the songs weren't angry. They weren't hopeful either, they just were. Like moss or memory, one prisoner had a voice like honey left in a wooden jar, rough but golden. He sang of rivers, of bread, of a girl with green ribbons and hands that smelled of rosemary. No one asked if she was real. It didn't matter. She lived in the song now. Another tapped poems into the wall, one syllable at a time. His neighbor answered in kind of duet made without sound, only rhythm, and still the prison stood, unmoved, but not untouched, because music, even when broken, even when whispered through clenched teeth, has roots, and roots move stone when no one is watching. One guard found himself humming long after the prisoners had fallen silent. He didn't know the words, just the shape of the melody. It stayed with him, like smoke, like fog that never quite lifted. Not every song was gentle. Some were sharp, mocking, aimed like arrows at the rules, the walls, the world outside. But even those had weight. Even those had beauty, because to sing in a place that wants silence is a kind of victory. And so they sang. Of mothers, of meals, of trees they might never see again. The songs changed, shifted, but they never stopped, even as prisoners left, even as cells were cleaned, even as years passed and names faded from record. The echoes stayed. Stone remembers sound, even if it never answers back. And if you walk through certain ruins today, you might feel it. A tremor beneath your feet, a pressure in your chest, not fear, not sorrow, just a note, held too long, still ringing for someone to join in. And that brings us to our next chapter, where sound gave way to silence, not from punishment, but from the weight of eyes. Eyes that didn't need proof, only stillness. The room was quiet, not with reverence, with waiting. Wooden benches lined the walls, polished by the backs of people who had sat in fear and in fury. But today, it was her. She stood in the center, not shackled, not bound, but still. She could not move. The court didn't need ropes. It had eyes, dozens of them, all fixed on her like nails, hammered in by silence. There were no cries for justice, no gavel, no flames, just a long table, a long pause, and a woman who had once said too much to the wrong man in the wrong tone on the wrong day. The charge? Disruption, unwomanly speech, a gaze that lingered too long on the rector's hands. They asked her questions, but the answers didn't matter. The answers were already written in the way she stood, the way she folded her fingers, how she blinked. She didn't tremble. That was a problem. She didn't look down. Worse, she smiled once, briefly, and someone on the bench breathed in like a prayer turned sideways, because in Tudor Britain, judgment didn't always come from words. It came from watching and deciding and punishing without the mess of proof. They asked about her neighbors, about a child's illness, about a bad harvest and a cat, unrelated things, threaded together like a noose made of lace. And she answered, calm, clear, which only made it worse, because fear was expected, panic was familiar, but calm, that looked too much like guilt that had grown clever. A cough echoed in the gallery. Someone muttered about the look in her eye. That was all it took, not evidence, just agreement, judgment, passed by consensus rather than clarity. They called it a ruling, but it was more of a shrug, wrapped in ceremony. She was to be watched, avoided, named without being named. No jail, no stocks, just eyes wherever she went. Eyes. In the bakery, in the fields, in the space between two candles at supper. She became a presence, unwelcome, unblamed, untrusted, not because of what she did, but because of how she held her hands when she thought no one was watching. People say justice is blind, but in places like this, justice was all eyes. Cold ones that saw too much and understood too little. And that brings us to our next chapter, where the crime was small, the shame was large, and life changed forever over something no one even remembered doing. It didn't take much. Not in towns like this. Not in years like those. A glance held too long. A loaf of bread too warm, too unsupervised. A word misheard. A joke poorly timed. The smallest things became weighty when held by people who didn't want to drop them. She was 15 when she took the crust. Not from hunger, really. Just habit. The bread had been left too close to the edge of the stall, and her hands were quicker than her thoughts, the baker saw. Said nothing. But the next day, everyone else did. She was called Snatch, quietly. At first. Then to her face. Then to her father, single quotes S. And O punishment from the court. No formal word from the mayor, but the punishment came anyway. In the way coins were passed to her with hesitation. In the way friends stopped lingering at her doorstep. In the way boys began to laugh with something harder in their throats. The crust had been eaten in for bites. But the consequence stretched into years. Another man was seen speaking too kindly to a married woman at the well. He said, "Your scarf looks warm." That was all. By sundown, it was known he had intentions. By the next week, he had none of his old clients. One mistake. One misstep. And the town didn't just remember it, rehearsed it. Small crimes had long shadows, and not all of them were real. Some were stories. Tales passed along fences. Half-heard confessions inflated by the space between mouths. A girl or read, too. Often. A man drank too slowly. A widow refused to remarry. That was enough. They called it order. But it felt more like erosion each day. A little dignity rubbed away. A little silence layered over your name. People learned to live under it. Bent their backs a bit more. Smiled less. Spoke in safe words. And kept their hands behind them, where no one could see what they weren't taking. Sometimes the punishment was isolation. Sometimes labor. One boy was made to carry buckets for a month because he'd spit too close to the chapel wall. They said it wasn't about the spit. It was about disrespect, but really, it was about reminding everyone that the smallest things could grow teeth. And yet, they endured. The girl who stole the bread grew into a woman who baked her own. Sold it at a different stall. Cheaper. Better. And the town eventually came back, not with apology, but with appetite. She didn't forget, but she forgave. Quietly. In the way warm loaves forgive the cold, the man by the well left for a while. Returned with stories. With songs. With a wife who didn't mind his slowness, and the town found new people to whisper about, because judgment is a wheel. And in small towns, it never stops turning, but sometimes people learn to step off, to survive the small crimes, to soften before they harden. And that brings us to our next chapter, where punishment wasn't loud, but eternal. A man made to walk in circles, not to escape, but because escape was never part of the sentence. A T was a circle, pressed into the dirt behind the gall. Not drawn, but worn, a perfect loop. 12 paces across. 12 paces around, they called it. The punishment path. The wheel. The mind turner, but mostly they just pointed and said, "That's where he walks." No walls. No whips. Just an instruction. Keep moving. He wasn't told for how long. That was the worst of it. The sentence had no number. Just shape, a circle. He had stolen from the tithe barn. Not much. A sack of oats. A scrap of salted meat, enough to matter, not enough to forgive. And so he walked. The first day, he tried to pace with pride. Head high. Steps even, but circles turn pride into something else. Repetition doesn't sharpen a dull S.by day 3. He walked slower, his left leg dragging, his right foot blistered from always being on the outside. The guards didn't shout. They didn't need to. The punishment was self-sustaining. As long as he moved, they watched. As long as he tired, they nodded. He wasn't allowed to stop. Only to eat, to drink, to sleep in a cell that smelled of dust and ash. Then it was back. To the circle the townsfolk visited. Some out of pity. Some for the novelty. Children dared each other to step into the circle when he paused. None of them did. There was something sacred about it, and not in a holy way. In the way we sense a curse without needing to see it, he tried walking backward. Once. They stopped him, not because it was faster, but because it was rebellion. And rebellion made circles dangerous. One day, it rained. The path turned to mud. His feet slipped. He fell. They gave him a stick. Not to lean on, to keep walking. And he did, because the path had become more than punishment. It was routine, ritual, an ache that no longer surprised him. In the silence of the yard, he hummed, low, wordless, just something to fill the space between step and breath. Someone once asked, "When will they let you stop?" He shrugged, not because he didn't know, but because he didn't expect to find out. They didn't remove him. He simply stopped coming. One day, he didn't rise, didn't eat, didn't answer. The circle was left empty. But it stayed, and no one walked it. Not officially, but some said you could feel it still. The worn ring in the ground. The imprint of endurance, of a man made to move. Not toward anything, but away from stopping. Punishment, they said, should fit the crime. But this punishment fit the fear of what happens when people don't move as they're told. And that brings us to our next chapter, the final lash, the softest one, the one that didn't break skin, but said goodbye to all the others that did. They said it was the last. Not of all whippings, just his. And somehow that made it harder to bear, because when pain is certain, you build walls. But when it's almost over, you feel everything again. He stood in the yard, back to the post, hands bound, flesh already, lined with scars, some new, some faded to memory. The crowd was smaller this time. Not many had come. Perhaps they'd grown tired. Perhaps they'd grown ashamed, or perhaps they knew that final punishments aren't for spectacle. Therefore, silence. The man with the lash didn't speak, didn't pray, just stepped forward, cord in hand, and waited for the nod the magistrate gave it, almost reluctantly, and the first lash fell. It was light, too light, almost like a touch. The man flinched, but not from pain, from memory. Each lash that followed was less a strike and more a breath, soft, measured, intentional. As if they weren't punishing now, but saying goodbye to the punishment itself. By the 10th, the crowd had stopped watching. By the 12th, the man cried, not because it hurt, but because it didn't, because in that quiet ending, he remembered every scream he hadn't allowed himself before. The whip was set down. The post was unfastened. The man turned. No bow, no nod, just a look, and then he walked out the gate, barefoot, bloodless, but marked all the same. The town spoke of him for days, then weeks, and then not at all, because the story ended too softly. And soft endings don't echo, but somewhere the post remained. Its wood splintered, its shadow long, the whip too, coiled in a drawer, not retired, just resting, because punishment doesn't disappear. It just sleeps and waits to be needed again. But in that moment, for that man, the silence was a kindness, an acknowledgement, a release. He didn't live famously, didn't speak of it, didn't tell tales, but he gardened, walked slowly, sat with his back to the sun, and when others came, he didn't judge. He didn't preach. He simply said, there are softer ways. Sometimes they work better, and that brings us to our final chapter, where all of these stories set alike. Dust and the memory of punishment becomes something quieter than pain. Time doesn't remember punishment the way pain does. Pain marks the body deep, vivid, personal, but time? Time dulls it, files the edges, lets the names fade, the faces blur, until only shape remains, a rope, a stool, a circle, but not the person inside it, and maybe that's a mercy. Maybe forgetting is the last kindness history can offer, because not every punishment was just. Not every scar was earned, but they happened. And for a long time, they were considered normal, necessary, civil, a way to keep the peace by giving the pain a schedule. Every morning, someone paid for something. A whisper, a bite, a glance, and then the world continued. Laundry was washed, wood was chopped. Children were born, even while someone sat in the stocks, cold and watched. Life boiled on, unmoved. That's the part history rarely records. The part where suffering happens and the world doesn't pause, because suffering in those quiet towns was part of the rhythm, but so was healing. The girl who the brank learned to sing again. Softly, to herself, the man in the shoes of shame walked, barefoot for years, until the earth forgot the shape of his limp. The woman from the cage was never mentioned again. But the tree grew wide, and the grass beneath it thickened, as if the roots were trying to cover something, and maybe they were, because nature forgets too. But it forgets by growing, by pushing forward softly, and so did the people. One day, the stalks were removed, rotten, splintering, thrown on a fire with no ceremony. The whip was found in a drawer, molded, coiled in on itself like a snake that forgot how to strike. No one used it. No one missed it, and the pillory turned into part of a barn wall, its holes patched with fresh planks. Its past silent beneath new nails. They didn't talk about it. They just lived differently, less noise, more watching. A cautious sort of kindness that made room for mistakes without needing iron to answer them. And the garden, it grew, quietly, out behind the jail. Even after the jail was gone, someone replanted the mint. Someone taught their child to water thyme. No one claimed it, but no one stopped it, because some things even forgotten leave behind a softness too gentle too. Uproot. In time, they forgot the names of the punished, but they remembered the silence. The feeling of standing near a person who'd survived something you hadn't. That kind of memory doesn't need a book. It needs only breath and a pause, and sometimes that's justice. Not the sharp kind, not the kind that demands, but the kind that simply doesn't return, that fades, so something kinder can grow in its place. So tonight, if you're still listening, still resting, still waiting for sleep to take the corners of your mind, know that this story is done, and it ends not with fire, not with chains, but with forgetting, not because we don't care, but because the world needs softness as much as it needs memory, and sometimes, to heal, you have to leave the punishment behind. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. So let the lash fall silent. Let the stalks rot. Let the cage rust into the trees, and let us all walk gently now. Not in shame, but in peace. Good night, and may your sleep be softer than the justice they once believed in.